Senior Minister of State Dr. Mohammed Maliki bin Osman, Minister of State Sam Tan, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Tim Huxley, the Executive Director of the Asia Office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in Singapore, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 24th IISS Fullerton Lecture. For those of you who are watching the webcast of this Fullerton Lecture, I should say that we're holding this event in the Straits Room of the historic Fullerton Hotel in the heart of Singapore's financial district. As many of our guests this evening already will know, the spirit and purpose of this distinguished lecture series is to inspire informed and intelligent debate on matters of international importance from an international perspective. The first Fullerton Lecture was delivered in March 2012 by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. We're deeply honored this afternoon to have with us as our 24th Fullerton Lecturer, Erna Solberg, Prime Minister of Norway. Erna Solberg has been Prime Minister of Norway since October 2013. She has represented the Conservative Party in the county of Hordaland in Norway's parliament since 1989 and was Minister of Local Government and Regional Development from 2001 to 2005. Before becoming Prime Minister, she was the Conservative Party's parliamentary leader and was a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Health and Care Services Affairs, the Standing Committee on Foreign and Defence Affairs, and the Electoral Committee. She has also previously been a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Norway is a relatively small country, its population of slightly more than 5 million people being more or less equivalent in size to Singapore's, but of course spread out over a much larger country. But it's also a rich country. It's used its wealth to promote a high degree of social equality at home. At the same time, it has a very substantial development assistance program contributing a higher percentage of GDP, more than 1%, to development aid, a higher percentage than any other country in the world. Norway's deep, long-term involvement in international development, the present government's commitment to these efforts, and the Prime Minister's own role as co-chair of the UN Secretary-General's Sustainable Goals Advocacy Group all mean that Erna Solberg is particularly well qualified to address the topic of the global goals, a roadmap to a sustainable, fair, and more peaceful future. So we look forward to her address this afternoon. Following the address, the Prime Minister has very kindly agreed to engage in conversation with us and to take questions from our substantial audience here in the Straits Room of the Fullerton Hotel. Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, ministers, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for welcoming me here in Singapore. And I would also like to thank the International Institute for Strategic Studies and Dr. Huxley for giving me this opportunity to address this distinguished audience. Of course, it's undeniably of interest to a politician to be given address to what is supposed to give thoughts or inspire to intellectual debate. As politicians, we usually, or intelligent debate, most people will probably say that political debates rarely are that. So maybe this will be a difference from the everyday work that we are doing. As Prime Minister of Norway and co-chair of the UN Secretary-General's Sustainable Development Goals Advocacy Group, I have many good reasons to visit Singapore. When the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon addressed this forum in 2012, he said that Singapore has much to give and the world has much to gain from the Singapore example. This is one important reason why I'm here. Ban Ki-moon referred to Singapore as an intellectual center and a financial crossroads. He emphasized the country's effective policies and its hard-working people. And as a result, it has achieved strong economic growth and prosperity. He also said that Singapore has shown the world that the dividend that comes from investing in education, healthcare, and in people, all of which is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. I do agree with him. I'm also here to learn from the people who are busy building this country and innovating every day. Singapore's sustainable urban development and inclusive economic growth are indeed very impressive. This evening, we are supposed to explore what it will take to achieve the global goals and to create a sustainable, fair, and safer world. Because I very often think that those 17 goals is about that. Sustainability, about fairness, but also about safety. Because there is no safety if not you're bringing the whole world with you into a better and more inclusive growth in the future. And let me start by highlighting some aspects of Singapore's development process that are very relevant to the SDG agenda. First, Singapore has shown that the rapid and inclusive growth is possible. Over the last 50 years, the people of Singapore has experienced economic and social progress on a scale that few others have seen. Secondly, Singapore has a strong track record on sustainable development through sound management of scarce resources like land, water, and nature. One of the many legacies of your late Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, was his vision of making Singapore a city in a garden. Of course, when you drive around here, you can see that he has managed. Even though it's so many people on such a small place, it's green in between everywhere. Third, and this is an important point, is a point with a bilateral twist. Although shipping is the most sustainable way to move large quantities of goods around the world, the global merchant fleet remains a major emitter of greenhouse gases. The development of green shipping is an area where Singapore and Norway can work together to make real contributions to a sustainable climate. And as you know, one of the SDGs is related to oceans. Oceans cover 70% of the world's surface. Moreover, 80% of the world ocean is more than 3,000 meters deep. As much as 90% has not yet been explored. Healthy oceans represent a vital protein reservoir for the world's growing population. As advanced maritime nations, Singapore and Norway could and should become ocean partners, pursuing opportunities that also will benefit the common good. And fourth, a sustainable future will depend on peace, stability, and good governance, both within and between nations. Singapore, like Norway, is a staunch advocate of a predictable international order, governed by law, not by might. The current geopolitical turbulence shows that this is more important than ever. For all small states, international laws are much more important than they are for the large ones. That's why we should keep fighting to make sure that the international law is abided by everybody. And this brings me directly to the most urgent international challenge, also for the SDG agenda. I am thinking about the crisis, the conflicts that are forcing millions of people to leave their homes and seek refuge. SDG 16 promotes just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. And this is to the very heart of the whole agenda. We know that it wasn't possible to achieve the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, in areas that was affected by crisis or conflict. As we know that on some levels, in fact, the increased conflicts zones around the world made sure that some of the progress that we had on the MDGs became slower the last year before 2015. Especially when you look at education, for example, where more than half of all of those who were not allowed to go to any educational institutions were in conflict areas and conflict zones. Just a few years ago, Syria was giving shelter to refugees from other countries. No, Syria is one of the main reasons why the world is facing the largest refugee crisis since World War II. Finding a political solutions to any armed conflict is a matter of utmost urgency. In Syria too, the longer it takes, the harder it will be to rebuild the country. And it's sad to remember that even though there was big lackages in Syrian government and institutions, it was a middle-income country. And when you see the pictures of Homs or Aleppo today, you see that the rebuilding will take a long, long time. And this is just the most current, but there are more examples like this around the world. At some point, the neighboring countries will no longer be able to cope with the ever-increasing numbers of refugees. Meanwhile, the civilian population in Syria will continue to suffer every day, every night, and every hour. The international community can neither accept nor afford to lose a whole generation. Millions of children and young people are trapped in conflicts or in refugee situations and risk being deprived of their right to education. This in turn makes them also more vulnerable to destructive elements and extremist propaganda. If young people are the future architects of peace and stability, they must have education. Together with other partners, Norway is in the progress of establishing a fund and coordinating mechanism to strengthen education opportunities for children and young people in conflict areas. We aim at launching this fund at the Istanbul Humanitarian Summit in May this year. It will be a concrete contribution to the SDG efforts in areas affected by crisis and conflicts, and we hope that it will receive broad support. While the events in Syria is very dramatic and receive a lot of international attention, this is only one of several ongoing crises. The whole world is affected. It is therefore vital that all countries and people see fragility, crisis, and conflict as a common global challenge, and that we take the appropriate action. We are interlinked in this world now in a way we have never been before, and we will be affected by the unsolved conflicts and crises around the world in a way we never have been before. Not long ago, few would have believed that 193 countries could agree on 17 ambitious and universal sustainable development goals. Clearly, the geopolitical and humanitarian situation in this last period before the SDG summit influenced the process, made 193 countries sign up for the 17 goals. Not just for those other countries, but also for ourselves. We also should meet the SDGs on equal opportunities for women, to get a gender balance, on the education, and on our environmental protection of and sustainable development. We have seen people's lives being destroyed at a huge scale. We have seen millions fled from their homes. There is widespread destabilization, and it threatens the common global good. At the same time, we have witnessed an increase in violent extremism, growing youth unemployment, and of course the Ebola epidemic that showed that we were not good enough on tackling those type of epidemics. Global warming has also become an issue of serious concern. Faced with this type of cocktail of shocks and challenges, it has become clear that business as usual is not viable. Actions has to be taken and has to be taken urgently. So when the world leaders meet at the UN in New York met in the UN last September, we adopted the SDGs with enthusiasm. I think many leaders saw this ambitious set of goals as the best political response available. And now is a trillion-dollar question. What will it take to achieve the SDGs? Will it just be goals, or will it really be a working plan the next 15 years? As you know, the main difference between the SDGs and the MDGs is that it's universal. They apply to every country in the world, rich or poor, and encompass economic, social, and environmental progress. We all have to do our work at home, as well as beyond our borders, for the common good. Under this new agenda, all countries are in fact developing countries. There is not the developed and the developing. We are now all developing. It will take some time before this notion sinks in throughout the world, but it's important to remember. It's also important to understand that the new set of 17 goals is not something governments can simply deliver to their population. Achieving the goals will take time. It will require both broad-based partnership and innovative new approaches. We are talking about a process, not an instant solution. The main engine for both national and global development is not just the political life, it's basically the business sector. Consumers all over the world are becoming more aware about the sustainability issues. And we see that innovative companies already are aligning their business strategies with the new global goals. Which investment model that attracts the private sector, financing for sustainable development can be scaled up from millions to trillions. We can also build on the progress made during the MDG era. Although some goals were not achieved, others were reached well before the deadline. Notably, the first goal on halving the number of people living in extreme poverty. And we know why. It was because of economic development, not at least in Asia. The fact that you could lift so many people out of poverty. And I'm pleased to see that the SDG agenda aims to complete the unfinished business on poverty eradication, on education, health, and the empowerment of girls and women. Investment in human capital is absolutely fundamental for sustainable development. I don't think it's possible to have development that are sustainable unless you are doing it through the people. So there are 5 points that I consider to be very important for the SDG success. First, progress on any given goal will be faster if we work in partnerships involving governments, private sectors, the UN agencies, international development banks, civil society, academia, and NGOs. We just have to work together, all of us, to achieve this. The UN Secretary General's Every Woman, Every Child Health Initiative is an example that is excellent on this. It's a partnership between national governments, the UN, World Bank, and Gates Foundation. Last year, I took part in the launching of the Global Financial Facility, which is an innovative financing mechanism for the Every Woman, Every Child initiative. The Vaccine Alliance, known as Gavi, is another outstanding example. Gavi was created in January 2000 based on a pledge of $750 million over 5 years. They brought together the UN agencies, government, vaccine industry, various private sectors and civil society actors. It helped improve childhood immunization coverage in poor countries and accelerated access to new vaccines. By 2015, Gavi has helped to ensure 500 million additional children were reached. This prevented more than 7 million deaths. And Gavi aims to reach 300 million more children by 2016 to 2020. This will prevent a further 5 to 6 million deaths among children at a young age. If you put these figures in perspective, Their aim from 2016 to 2020 is equivalent to the entire population of Norway or Singapore. Similar partnership and financial mechanisms must be established in all the SDG areas. My government has had education as its #1 development priority. We are doubling Norway's funding for global education in this parliamentary period. However, more funding is still needed, so it's an open invitation to participate. At the Summit of Education in July last year, I launched the initiative of the International Commission on the Financing of Global Education Opportunities. Under former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown's leadership, the Commission will report to UN in September. I look forward to reading their recommendations and hope that we will see innovative private partnership approaches in it. This was the first. We have to work together. Second, the 17 SDGs makes up a holistic, sustainable development agenda. We must move away from a sectoral approach and cultivate synergies between the goals. Education for girls, for example, correlates strongly and positively with health and with women's empowerment and with economic growth. You don't get good enough economic growth if you leave out half of the talent in your country. So there's a good reason why everybody should also support education for girls. In turn, this also has the effect that it reduces the likelihood of early marriage, of early pregnancy, and of sexually transmitted diseases. Every extra year of education empowers girls and women and strengthens equal rights. So there's a mixture of the different SDGs in focusing, for example, on education. Economic growth is also boosted due to the increased participation of women in the paid workforce. The positive ripple effects of educating a girl are significant. I probably shouldn't need to say this in Singapore, but there's a lot of other countries, also somewhere in your neighborhood, that we should continue to emphasize this on. The ripple effects will multiply over generations. When an educated girl grows up and has children of her own, she will transfer her knowledge and values to her children, boys as well as girls. And of course, some would say that doesn't men do the same? Sorry, you don't. Which has something to do with still traditional ways of dealing with things in a family. And we have to look at similar synergies and exploit that for the rest of the SDGs. There will be interlinkages. The third point I have is to establish goals will not in itself lift people out of poverty. Unless governments show the political will and resolve to make progress on any given goal, progress will be limited or non-existent. The SDGs efforts must be accompanied by coherent strategies, policies and investment. For many countries, it will be necessary to improve tax collection, halt illicit financial flows, eliminate tax havens, and actively combat corruption in order to invest in sustainable development. I, in fact, applaud the fact that we have the Panama Papers shown off these days, because it shows how interconnected tax havens are to corruption in some countries, to the possibilities for illegal, unlawful actions to whitewash and put their money through it. So I think it's an important part of the openness and discussion, and I think it's good that it's been shown off. The fourth is that the global goals reinforce global norms. I think the normative aspects of SDGs will be even more evident in the SDGs era, as the agenda is wider and insists that no one is to be left behind. The MDGs strengthen a global sense of responsibility for ensuring that every child's right to education, to live, to get good health. Greater progress in primary education enrollment was made from 2000 to 2015. One important lesson, however, is that the quality of educational services did not always keep up with the increase in enrollment. Unfortunately, millions of children have gone through years of primary school without learning to read and write. Good quality services must be ensured in the SDG campaign. And fifth, global goals raise expectations within countries and across borders. They add weight to the demand made by grassroots movements and civil society groups. Peer pressure from neighboring countries can also play a role. That's why it's good to have activism also to reach those goals. And the human rights dimension of women's empowerment is often on the international agenda. However, the fact that gender equality makes strong economic sense is not receiving enough attention. Gender equality is probably the most underutilized of all the development tools, and that was my point number 6. Not just because I'm a female prime minister and because I have a daughter, but because I know that the economics, the soundness for any country not to use the whole basis of your talent doesn't make any sense. And we have to continue to focus on that. The UNDP Gender Inequality Index shows countries with greater gender equality have a higher per capita gross domestic product. So if you don't believe in the fairness, the talent argument, believe in the economic argument. I strongly like the fairness part of it too, but it's, if not, the economic one is good. The resources of women and girls are essential for poverty eradication and sustainable development. And there can be no excuse for not achieving gender equality by 2030, because then there will be half of the world's population that is lacking behind if we don't reach it. In conclusion, the SDG provides the international community with a roadmap to the future we all want. A world where extreme poverty and hunger have been eradicated, a planet where the natural environment and climate are no longer under threat. We all need maps to see what the direction to take to reach the given destination. At the same time, the SDGs show us how to reach economic, social, and environmental sustainability. If we make the right choices over the next 15 years, both on the world level, but also in each individual country, we can eradicate extreme power and hunger. We can achieve a fair and more peaceful future where no one is left behind. And we can do all this in a way that safeguards our planet's natural environment and climate. And personally, I don't think we have a possibility of not trying to reach this. Not just because 193 countries have signed up to it, but because now conflict, threats are so interlinked with natural catastrophes, with conflict, with the lack of hope for jobs around the world, that we need to address these issues also on a security basis. So from Singapore to Norway, the road taken between now and 2030 will make, in fact, all the difference. If we manage to even develop our countries, we know that we are not reaching our 17 goals in Norway, even if we are topping on some of the international lists. We know that we have more to do, and that we will continue to have to do it every year, because there is a lot of challenges around, and be a partner to other countries trying to achieve the same SDGs. Thank you.
Prime Minister, thank you very much for that really excellent Fullerton lecture. You started off by identifying some aspects of Singapore's development process that you see as relevant to the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. And importantly, you noted that Singapore, like Norway, strongly advocates a predictable international order, as you put it, governed by law rather than by might. Maybe that's something we can come back to discuss a bit later. And then you went on to discuss the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals have at their heart the promotion of just, peaceful, and inclusive societies, and you pointed to the particularly massive challenge posed by the Syrian refugee crisis. But the main part of your lecture concerned the challenges of achieving the SDGs. What will it take, as you put it? And you emphasize the importance of partnership between various sectors. You spoke about the importance of cultivating synergies between the various SDGs, the need for governments to implement coherent strategies, and the fact that global goals will not only reinforce global norms, but will also raise expectations. And you stressed that gender equality makes strong economic sense. And you concluded with a very strong point about the SDGs providing a route to economic, social, and environmental sustainability, and that the choices that are made over the next 15 years are going to be absolutely critical. If I may, to start off the discussion, I'd like to take advantage of my position as chair to ask you one or two questions, to raise one or two points relating to your lecture. The first is about Norway's specific contributions to achieving the SDGs. Where do you see your own country being able to make a special contribution and to make a special difference in progress towards achieving the SDGs?
On our own internal policies, if that's what you're asking, we still have a need to have more inclusive growth. We need to create more jobs for those who are not 100% productive in the workforce. Norway has a very good welfare system, but we have a welfare system that is that also it also camouflages a bit the fact that when you have a high productive society, some people are not in the position that they can be 100% active in the workforce. And because we have very small wage differences in our country, they end up outside the labor market. And we need to have policies to include them into that, because they are not really sick or disabled to work, but they are not able to work at the same pace and activity level as the rest of us are doing. That's where we have to start to change a little bit and to discuss how we can do that. Also, it has something to do with our economy being sustainable for the long run, but for me, that's the most important part, that people also feel, I mean, you should feel that you are a part of your society. And when you are 18 or 23 years old and are told you will never get a job in our society, but we will give you a benefit that you can stay on for the rest of your life. I mean, that does something to people. And it does make them feel that they cannot take control over their own life and society. And I think it's important for us to address these issues. I mean, how can we do that to make sure that our growth is inclusive, that we can create enough jobs to do it. And I think that's our biggest inequality issue in Norway. That's where I sometimes say that the SDGs maybe should have a little bit more about, not just about quantity, but also on quality, because to us that's big quality part. Then there are some small and different things on the different. We have a big responsibility for oceans. As an ocean country, the Norwegian territories, I think it's more than 2 times as large territory in the sea as our lands are. Of course, we have a large responsibility for life at sea, and which we would like to partner with more countries in the future to work on how can we make sure that everything we do is sustainable, from fish farming to sell salmons to Asia, to the way we are harvesting the wild stock, but also how we do the maritime fleet. How do they pollute? So to work on these issues, which we will need some national activity, but also international rules and regulation, because Our maritime, all of the international ships are polluting quite a lot, even if they are, and we have to make sure that these rules and regulations are done. We have done well on taking care of our wild stock of fish, meaning that we are harvesting it without exploiting it too much, in a balance, in agreement with Russia and Iceland and all. We are always having discussion on how much we can fish every year, but we have a system that makes this function. I was in Indonesia last year, and they were very interested in how can we do the same type of system, because they were feeling that their fishing resources was exploited in a way that it was not sustainable, and you will need that also in your. All nations who love to eat fish should be aware that you should have sustainable catching policies and rules and regulations. These are areas which are different to what you usually would say, because we have a heavily invested work now on education for girls, which we really do sponsor internationally and really have tried to lift up, because we think it's so important for the whole development part of this agenda. But I think all countries will find something on this list that they are not perfect on. And still we have some challenges on gender equality, even if the government is nearly 50-50. And a small challenge to the Singapore government, of course. One female ministers. Now, you have to do better. You have to do better.
I think that's a very important point about the SDGs, is that it's not just about rich countries helping poor countries, it's about rich countries developing aspects of their own societies and economies. But in terms of your aid budget, where is that going to be focused?
We have made a pledge that we will double the part of our aid budget that goes to education, which is then we have said that we will have a focus on conflict areas now. We have always had a focus on the poorest countries, but when we have now discussed where are the poorest people living, some of them are living in the poorest countries of the world that need help for their development. But quite a lot of the poorest people are living in conflict areas. So if you can work more on reducing the conflicts and creating development, do more preventive work when conflict problems arises, then you will make sure that there are not more poor people out of those conflicts. Of course, there is an inequality issue in some countries. I mean, like Latin America, where you have a lot of poor people, but you have quite a rich state. I mean, that's not that's not something that we think that we should do anything about through our development aid, but focusing on prevention of conflict. And if you look at the belt that some of you would say that Europe is now over-focusing on the refugee issues, but of course it is a big impact. When more than 1 million people are seeking refuge in Europe here, and they are coming, on the way that they are coming into our countries, it does affect us, because we are committed to our international standards, to the Refugee Convention and all of this, but it's also difficult, to integrate all of these people who are coming into our societies. There are challenges. But we know that this is just the first part of what could become a large wave in the future. There's going to be 1 billion more Asians before 2000 the next 100 years, but there are going to be 2 billion more Africans, and they are reaching 1 billion now, and they are estimated to become 3 billion people living in Africa. If you're not creating jobs in Africa, they will go over the Mediterranean. They will. So you have to make sure that. So if you don't have inclusive governments, if you don't get up the economic growth in those countries, it's also a part of our challenge in the future, directly into the European continent. And we have problems with creating enough jobs for our own people.
Just shifting the focus a little bit, quite early in your lecture just now, you talked about the importance for international order and the rule of law in international affairs as being a principle that Norway has in common with Singapore. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you see the challenges to international order, both in your own country's immediate environment and perhaps also in this part of the world.
Well, I think we find them in a lot of different fields and different areas. Of course, sometimes you will find them in trade. Even if we have a WTO regulation on trade, for example, there's a small island in my constituency, nearly out in the sea. They have 700 inhabitants, and the mayor said one day in 1991, I think, and they said, when they sneeze in America, we get the flu here, because they were heavily dependent on fish farming, and suddenly they got a decision that put a heavy tariff on importing live. That's one area where you see the big countries, and even if they kept on with this long after all of the WTO regulations, it ended up, I think they held on to that 17 years until it stopped. At that time, we have to build up new markets. That's a small portion. The largest one we see around us is, of course, the annexation of Crimea, when Russia just rolls into neighboring countries. In 1994, they signed an agreement ensuring the borders of Ukraine. Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons that were stationed in Ukraine at that time, and Russia, US, and all of the other, I think 4 of the largest countries in the world, guaranteed their borders, and suddenly you get this shift, which of course is, to us, on a security issue. It's the biggest break that we have seen in Europe since the Second World War of international law. Of course, what we see in the support for both cyber but also hybrid warfare in Ukraine and other, especially in those areas, is of course the big threats to us on international law, and we see a more unpredictable Russia, and that's we have a good relationship on the working together with Russia on our small and big problems in the north. We've had good working relations with them, but they are more unpredictable. They have broken international law. Of course, that gives us it changes the security environment around us.
And what about in the wider world, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region? Do you see any challenges to international order and the rule of international law in this region?
Of course, I see that there are some border disputes that leads to big tension here that should have been governed by international law, that should have been solved by the law of the sea, and not by the fact that some countries can establish rights and others challenge them, and there is no negotiation. We need to get those types of things into international negotiations and not just change the fact on the ground. I think it's important that we had this type of regulations and discussions in international forums. We now know we have after 27 years of negotiations, I think nearly 40 years, we settled in 5-6 years ago, we settled the border in the north between Norway and Russia, in the sea. On the land, it's always been clear, but in the sea. Of course, this, and that's what, at that time, all of our borders in way was established and no more disputes. And I think we need international, to make sure that we get that type of disputes into an international arrangement of settling them, because it increases the... And then, of course, you have a country like North Korea, which is, well, they are not adhering to any international law for the time being, so which is very difficult.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. If it's all right with you, I'd like to ask our audience if they have any questions for you. I'm sure they will. If you'd like to ask a question, could you just raise your hand and the microphone will come to you, and once I recognize you, Maybe you could stand up and say who you are and what your affiliation is. Simon Tay.
Madam Prime Minister, I'm Simon Tay. I'm the chairman of the Singapore Institute of National Affairs. Tim, thank you for recognizing me. Madam Prime Minister, you mentioned about partnerships between the governments and the private sector. And this morning, you gave a very good talk for the Norway Asia Business Summit. Could I draw you out on that? How do you see governments working with private sector, and particularly the Norway, of course, has a large sovereign fund. How do you think the sovereign fund needs to screen investments, etc., so that the right impacts get done by businesses in pushing forward the Sustainable Development Goals?
We are, there is a board of ethics committee that the sovereign fund has, who gives them guidance to what type of companies, what type of demand should you put. This is a very open and big discussion in Norway. Of course, we have banned them to invest in what we would say is break of international law. They are not, of course, allowed to do, when companies are breaking international law or it's breaking of conventions, they cannot invest in them. We've also said that that's on the tobacco industry. They are not investing in the tobacco industry because of health. But on the other hand, we say that you should also, it shouldn't be we invest or we not invest. Maybe you can, as an investor, put demands on the companies and say that we will withdraw our investments if you are not fulfilling in that type of regulations that we would like you to follow. And we have developed in a way our guidelines towards the sovereign fund in that direction. And then they have their own committee that gives them advice, meaning that they should also be active in some companies that and put up the flag and say, this, we don't accept this. So if you don't change your policies, we will withdraw. But it's sometimes very difficult because it's such a big company, and when you withdraw from large companies because of that type of reasons in some countries, you always get a diplomatic dispute or an ambassador trying to go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway and say this is not right. But we are trying to do that, and we say it should be independent on we give the broad guidelines, then they have this ethics committee that give them this follow-up, and then it's politically hands-off, because unless we will end up in discussions with a lot of countries. Our sovereign fund now owns 1% of the world stock exchange around the world. So there's a potential for a lot of meetings in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs if we don't tell them that this is hands-off on the individual decisions. And we made that change last year. Before that, if you withdrew from a company, it was the Ministry of Finance that made that decision. And we have now decided that they should follow the guidelines. We should scrutinize that they do it, but the individual decisions is no longer on any politician's level, and which is a great relief. And probably more efficient, because it's more difficult if a politician has to make that last decision.
Thank you. Next question, please. At the back on this side, in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, Jessica from a social enterprise called Impact, but previously with Richard Curtis and Project Everyone. Just curious, out of the 17 SDGs, globally, which do you think will be the hardest to be achieved?
Good question.
I think they're so interlinked. I think if you don't reach, the hardest one to reach is also the one I think is most basic for reaching the other ones, and that's SDG 16. That's about good governance and institutions to build that type of trust. If you don't have that, I think it's difficult to have sustainability in a lot of the other ones. I think you can do more achievement. I think it's also the most difficult ones, because it will, if you really want to have rule of law in all of countries, if you really have to have institutions with trust for the people, there are some governments that is going to have a bit of a problem, because they are not really following that up. Even if they have signed up for this, I think that will be the biggest challenge. But it's also, I think, for the sustainability of things, the most important. Because I don't think you will get that really big change in the world if you don't have a system that allows for strong institutions that are also independent of, for example, to get courts that are independent of the governments in their societies. So you get the rule of law in real time functioning around the world. But then, of course, that's one of the SDGs that is so. It's formulated in a way that a lot of countries will say we are already achieving this, which I think, to be honest, I think all of us have to work harder to make sure that we have that trust for the institutions and the institution building in our societies.
Thank you. Sir.
My name is Dufay. I'm a faculty member of one of the local universities where we get lots of blonde kids from Norway every winter.
That's good.
Norway's wealth and its ability to do good deeds comes from hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons have been blamed for a large part of global warming and other environmental issues. As we get away from hydrocarbons, what's the future of Norway to continue to have its high standard of living and to good deeds around the world? Would you comment on this issue, please?
Yes, the first deposit we had on the Sovereign Fund was in 1996, and we did good deeds before the 1996 too, a time when we were investing in oil and gas and not getting revenues from the oil and gas industries. I think, if I'm very honest, I don't think that the real reason is that, of course, our ability helps us. But Norway is a country that comes out of quite a lot of Puritanism and with a lot of international engagement before. Coming from our low church societies, we were sending missionaries all around the world. We are not trying to save the rest of the world by preaching the word anymore, but we are trying to maybe doing that. I think it's part of the international solidarity. I think 70% of the Norwegian population in opinion polls today say they are in support of giving international aid. And I think that will continue in the future also without having the same type of revenue. But our ability to give as much money will depend on our economic activity. And of course, my biggest job as Prime Minister now is to make sure that we diversify our economy, that we can produce new jobs. And if we manage to do that, that we produce new jobs, new income, I think the Norwegian people will still be very interested in helping for the development in other countries. I think the interconnectedness is something I think Norwegians understand very much. And there is a basis of solidarity in the Norwegian population. But we need to get the money also. And that's the national job. We are trying to diversify our economy. We are trying to increase investment in other sectors. We are doing a lot on R&D. And then, of course, our sovereign fund helps us because in a period of transition, the public budgets are not suffering so much as in other countries where the budget would have gone down because of the situation, because we have this buffer in our sovereign fund. But you have to, I think Norway will continue to have an aim as partner, but we need the ability.
Thank you. Question from this side, sir.
I'm a professor at the BI Norwegian Business School. One of the things that really destroys achieving the global development goals would be all the financial flows, the capital flows that goes outside the tax system and the government system. This has been highlighted in Europe now with the Panama Papers. What can governments like the Norwegian government and the Singaporean governments do with that? And that includes all of their own investments.
I think it's important that we focus international work on openness, or the transparency, the fact that we will always have some countries that have lower taxes than other countries have. And they might be attractive to have your companies in. But what we really need to do is to have the openness, to have make sure that you are not taking away money from your country into another one. We should have been taxed in the country of origin. I think in the development agenda, it's extremely important that more countries are, in fact, putting up a tax system. A lot of countries don't really have any tax system except for import taxes. That they're taxing imports goods, and you need to have more type of income tax. I think Ghana is an extreme example of this. They used to be, like a lot of other African countries, heavily dependent on development aid. I think they now have a budget that is 90% own income that they are getting from collecting small taxes and sales tax and other taxes, and they get a totally different sustainability in their economy due to that. But I mean, we need openness. We need, and I think for especially developing worlds, I mean, it's a challenge for us, yes, for the developed countries, but for the developing countries, you have leaderships in those countries that are taking away so much of the money that's supposed to go to their own population and diverting it into different accounts around the world. And that's why one of the reasons why it should be open, it should be transparent, it should be asked for, and you should, and maybe and you can end up by closing down activities from some of those countries. But we need to have an international agreement on this, and it's going to be difficult if a large percentage of those who are making the agreements have the money in some of those places. To be honest, that's what the Panama Papers also tells us.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We have time for one more question. I think there was someone. Yes, sir.
Francesco Mancini with the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. The previous round of development goals, the Millennium Development Goals, partially were achieved also because of the phenomenal economic development of China. And I was wondering how you see the role of China in this new round of goals, and if there is a particular goal on which Norway would like to partner with China to achieve it.
Of course, China has the big reason why we reached the goal of halving the number of people living, it was $1 a day when it was decided on. It's, of course, it was the economic development in China. And China is going to be important in all of these issues in the future. It's because it's still is the largest country in population. It will be extremely important on the environmental agenda, on the sustainability of environment, and that's, I think, is the most important. Of course, I would prefer to see a China which was more democratic and more open and all of this, but I mean, let's put the list where for the rest of the world, the most important thing is that they are reaching the climate goals today, and that they are following up on what they indicated as their targets and goals in the Paris meeting. Because if the world's second largest economy and the largest population in the world doesn't achieve a balance on the environment, we are not going to achieve it. And I think that's important. And then, of course, it's important to get the other very large country when it comes to population, to make sure that their economic growth that will probably help us to get even more people out of poverty. India doesn't do that by polluting as much as previous countries have done in that type of development stage.
Thank you. I think it's just about time, unfortunately, for us to bring this 24th Fullerton lecture to a close, but I'd like to thank you very much indeed for answering those very varied and important questions so frankly and so fully, and to thank you even more so for your Fullerton lecture. I think you conveyed a very clear understanding of some of the major challenges that will be faced in in trying to implement these 17 SDGs over the coming decade and a half. But I think also at the same time, you gave us a very strong flavour of Norway's national perspectives and some of the really important issues for your country, and we're very grateful for that. Thank you very much again.